5 years ago, the most notorious crime boss in Chicago drove away the woman he loved most on the night she was at her most desperate, all of it for one reason alone: to keep her alive. 5 years later, she returned with a heart covered in scars. The day they came face to face again, he had one arm wrapped around the waist of his movie star fiancée, a stand-in who looked eerily like her, and cast her an icy glance. "Stop pretending. The game is over." But she had no idea that the cold-blooded man still kept the wooden amulet she had given him years ago, hidden against the left side of his chest. And he never imagined that the velvet curtain concealing the blood-soaked secret behind her father's death was about to be drawn aside. The crime boss, who feared neither heaven nor earth, would find himself trembling beneath the hatred in the eyes of the woman he loved. What truth was about to tear them both apart? Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the story that follows. Her name was Delaney Hale. She had once been the most innocent young woman in Chicago, the daughter of the Marchetti family's most trusted accountant, and the first love of Lucian Marchetti, heir to the most notorious criminal empire in the city. Once, they had shared an entire sky of their own, but on that fateful night, the man she loved looked directly into her eyes, spoke the cruelest words she had ever heard, and forced her onto a flight out of the United States. She left with a shattered heart, never knowing that every word that had cut into her flesh and soul had been spoken for one reason alone: to keep her alive, to pull her beyond the reach of an underworld war that could have taken her life at any moment. During 5 years in a foreign land, Delaney tasted every kind of bitterness. Her mother died in poverty, while Delaney herself was left carrying an enormous debt and the burden of a past that others had buried beneath vicious false accusations. She hadn't returned to rekindle an old love. She had come back carrying one final wish: to restore her late father's good name and reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to her family. What Delaney could never have imagined was that throughout those 5 years, Lucian had never truly let her go. He had watched over her silently from afar, until a lie told by the person he trusted most convinced him that she was safe, that she was happy, and that she had forgotten him. Cruelly, that lie reached him at the very moment she was falling into the deepest hell of her life. Hidden beneath every cold and heartless performance, every misunderstanding layered upon another, and every wound that had never healed was a secret about her father's death. A secret his mother had concealed for 5 long years, one powerful enough to tear the two of them apart forever. That crime boss didn't fear the barrel of a gun. He didn't fear his enemies. He didn't even fear death itself. But there was one thing that could make his iron heart tremble: the eyes of the woman he loved, on the day she finally saw the truth. The arrivals hall at O'Hare International Airport was flooded that afternoon with the clamor of reporters jostling against one another, camera flashes bursting without pause like cold streaks of lightning, and through the suffocating crush of bodies, Delaney Hale emerged with an old suitcase in her hand, her slender shoulders wrapped in a trench coat frayed at the cuffs. She hadn't come there to be welcomed, nor was she the person toward whom the cameras were pointed. Yet a cruel twist of fate had placed her directly in the eye of the storm, because only a few steps away stood the man whose name made all of Chicago hold its breath, tall and imposing in a custom-tailored black suit that hugged his broad shoulders, his dark hair swept back to reveal an angular face as cold as if it had been carved from stone. It was Lucian Marchetti. The reporters shoved against one another and shouted their questions. "Mr. Marchetti, are you about to announce your engagement to Camille Rourke? Mr. Marchetti, may we have a comment?" He merely drew his brows together and replied with 2 glacial words: "No comment." His deep voice was enough to make the entire crowd falter. Delaney stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding with an old and painful rhythm that 5 years apart should have buried. Her smoky gray eyes lifted to meet those of the man who had once been her entire world, and before reason could stop her, the words had already slipped softly from her lips. "It's been 5 years. Do you truly not recognize me?" The entire world seemed to fall still in that moment. Lucian turned his head, and his blue-gray eyes met hers. For one fleeting instant, too brief for anyone else to notice, something fractured deep within his gaze, but it immediately froze over again beneath a layer of cold steel. He slipped an arm around the waist of the blonde woman standing beside him, a beautiful movie star who resembled Delaney so closely that the sight was almost chilling, and spoke with an indifference so cruel it bordered on mercilessness. "Enough. The game's over." Those 4 words cut across Delaney's chest like a blade of ice. She felt the blood in her veins turn cold, but she wouldn't allow herself to collapse in front of him. Not now. Not after sacrificing the best years of her youth in a foreign country to learn how to keep her back straight, even while her heart was breaking. She swallowed the bitter tightness in her throat and curved her lips into a smile every bit as cold as his. "Very well. I'm sorry I mistook you for someone else." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the camera flashes and that man behind her, telling herself that by returning this time, she had severed her ties with London forever. There was no way back now, nowhere left to run. Chicago was the final gamble of her life. But what Delaney didn't know was that behind her, Lucian's eyes continued to follow her frail figure until it disappeared completely beyond the glass doors, while a strange uneasiness, unlike anything he had ever known, began to rise inside him. The woman he had just seen contradicted everything he had believed for the past 2 years. The coat frayed at the cuffs, the shoes worn down at the heels, the gaunt face hidden beneath a thin layer of makeup, and above all, the eyes of someone who had walked through hell. None of it matched the reports Enzo, his most trusted bodyguard, had regularly sent him. Reports claiming that she was living well in London, that she had built a career of her own, that she was happy and had moved on. Lucian slowly clenched the hand inside his coat pocket, where his fingers touched the familiar little object he always carried with him, and an icy question began creeping into his mind. If she was truly happy, why had she returned looking like someone who had lost everything? At that same moment, in a secluded corner of the airport hall, the phone in Delaney's pocket began vibrating violently. She glanced at the screen, and her entire body went rigid. The message was brief, but it was enough to send an icy chill down her spine. "You've made it back to Chicago, haven't you? Don't forget the $800,000 debt still hanging over your head. I'm giving you exactly 1 month. Marcus Fenn." She gripped the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, then drew a deep breath to suppress the fear rising inside her, because she understood better than anyone that the man would never let her go, and the shadow of the past she had thought she'd left behind in London was still clinging relentlessly to her, even here, in the very city to which she had only just returned. The old bar sat at the quiet end of a narrow street in the south side of Chicago, its faded wooden sign still bearing the name Hales, in letters that time and weather had nearly worn away, and when Delaney pushed open the heavy door that evening, she braced herself for dust, cobwebs, and the suffocating weight of abandonment that 5 years of neglect should have left behind. Yet what greeted her instead made her breath catch in her throat, for the floors gleamed as though freshly polished. The long oak counter her father had once wiped down every night was spotless and warm under the dim light. The bottles behind the bar had been arranged in neat rows, and even the old jukebox in the corner, the one her mother used to love, had been dusted off and looked ready to hum to life at the touch of a coin. Delaney stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn bag. Because this was impossible. No one should have cared for this place. No one should have even remembered it existed. And least of all, should anyone have spent time and money restoring it to the way it looked in her memories. She walked slowly through the room, running her palm along the smooth surface of the counter, and a fragile ache rose in her chest as fragments of the past flickered before her eyes. Her father standing behind that very bar with a towel over his shoulder, laughing his warm, quiet laugh. Her mother swaying to an old song by the jukebox. A childhood that had been poor, but full of light before everything shattered. A sudden sound at the back of the room snapped her out of the memory, and she turned to see a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat stepping out from the storeroom. his presence sharp and controlled in a way that immediately marked him as someone who belonged to a dangerous world. And though she had never met him, something in his cautious bearing told her he was no ordinary stranger. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the wariness coiling inside her. And the man, whose name she would later learn was Enzo Ricci, hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than a simple answer required, his eyes flickering away from hers before returning with practiced composure. "I was only checking that everything was in order, miss. The place is yours to use now. Everything has been taken care of." His words were polite, smooth, and yet they carried an evasiveness that puzzled her, for he did not explain who had ordered the restoration, who had paid for it, or why a man with the bearing of a soldier from the underworld would concern himself with a crumbling bar on a forgotten street. "Taken care of by whom?" she pressed, taking a step toward him, but Enzo only inclined his head slightly and moved toward the door, his answer deliberately vague. "Someone who did not wish to be named. That is all I can say." And before she could demand more, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of his footsteps and a silence heavier than before. Delaney stood alone in the middle of the room, her mind spinning with confusion, because she could think of no one in this city who would extend such quiet kindness to her, no one who owed her anything, no one who would want to help the disgraced daughter of a dead bookkeeper, and it never once crossed her mind to connect this nameless generosity to the cold man who had discarded her at the airport only hours ago. She pushed the strange puzzle to the back of her thoughts, telling herself she could not afford to be distracted by mysteries when the road ahead of her was already so steep, and she reminded herself firmly of the three things that had brought her back across an ocean to reclaim this bar that held the last living memory of her parents, to clear the name of the father whose reputation had been buried in shame, and to sever forever the chains that Marcus Fenn had wrapped around her throat, the debt of $800,000 that threatened to drag her back into the darkness she had barely survived. Whatever kindness this place had shown, whoever the silent hand behind it might be, she could not let it soften her, for she had learned the hard way that in her life, nothing was ever given without a price. In the days that followed that bitter reunion at the airport, Lucian Marchetti found himself unable to shake the image of Delaney's hollow face and worn clothes from his mind, for it clawed at something deep inside him that he had long buried beneath layers of ice and control, and no matter how many times he told himself she was no longer his concern, the wrongness of it all kept pulling him back like a splinter lodged beneath the skin. He sat alone in his vast office atop the Marchetti Tower one night, the city sprawling beneath him in a glittering carpet of lights, and he turned over in his hands a small wooden charm worn smooth by years of touch, the very charm Delaney had carved for him with her own hands long ago. And as his thumb traced its familiar edges, a cold question repeated itself in his mind without mercy. If she had truly built a good life across the ocean, the way Enzo had assured him for the past 2 years, then why had she come home looking like a woman who had crawled out of a grave? The reports had all said the same thing, that she was thriving, that she had moved on, that she was happy, and he had chosen to believe them because believing them was the only way he could survive the guilt of having pushed her away. But the woman he had seen at the airport told a story those reports had never mentioned, and every instinct honed by a lifetime in the underworld screamed at him that something was terribly wrong. He knew there was only one way to uncover the truth without alarming her or exposing his own heart, and that was to keep her close, close enough to watch, close enough to protect, close enough to slowly peel back the mystery of what those 5 years had done to her. And so the next morning he summoned his men and gave an order that surprised even his most seasoned advisors, that a position was to be created for Delaney Hale within the legitimate arm of the family enterprise, the network of clean businesses that laundered the family name into respectability. The pretext was flawless, and no one thought to question it, for the family genuinely needed someone skilled in bookkeeping to manage the labyrinth of accounts, and who better than the daughter of Thomas Hale, the very man who had once kept those same ledgers with a precision no one had ever matched, So when the offer was extended to her, it carried the appearance of nothing more than a cold business decision, a chance for a struggling woman to earn an honest living. Lucian told himself this was purely a matter of surveillance and protection, that he needed only to understand what had happened and to ensure no harm came to her within his reach, and he refused to acknowledge the deeper current running beneath his reasoning, the simple, unbearable truth that after 5 years of telling himself he had let her go, he could not bring himself to watch her walk out of his life a second time. He arranged for her office to be placed near his own, close enough that he could observe her comings and goings, close enough that if trouble found her again, he would know before it was too late. And he convinced himself that this was strategy rather than longing, that a man in his position could not afford sentiment, yet each time he passed the empty desk that would soon be hers, something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business. Across the city in the opulent halls of the Marchetti estate, his mother Vittoria received word of the new hire with little more than a passing glance, for to her it seemed an utterly unremarkable decision, merely her son bringing a competent bookkeeper into the fold to handle tedious accounts, and it never occurred to her sharp and calculating mind to look twice at the name Delaney Hale, or to sense the storm quietly gathering beneath the surface of her son's carefully guarded expression. She was far too occupied with the delicate political marriage she had arranged between Lucian and the rising star Camille Rourke, an alliance meant to bind two powerful families together, and so she dismissed the matter entirely, never imagining that the woman her son had just pulled back into his orbit was the one person capable of unraveling everything she had spent 5 long years so carefully holding together. On her first morning inside the gleaming Marchetti Tower, Delaney arrived with her spine straight and her expression carefully blank, determined to treat this place as nothing more than a means to an end, a job that would let her chip away at the mountain of debt hanging over her head. But the moment she stepped into the marble lobby, she felt the weight of 100 curious eyes turning toward her, and the low hum of whispers rippling through the crowd of employees, like wind through dry grass. She could not understand at first why her presence stirred such attention, why people leaned toward one another with widened eyes and hushed voices the instant they caught sight of her face, and it was only when the crowd near the elevators parted that she finally understood. For gliding across the lobby with the effortless grace of someone accustomed to cameras, came a woman whose appearance struck Delaney like a physical blow. The woman was radiant, draped in designer clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year, her blonde hair styled to perfection and her makeup flawless, and yet beneath all that polish was a face that mirrored Delaney's own, with an uncanny precision that sent a cold shiver crawling down her spine, the same shape of the eyes, the same curve of the jaw, the same delicate line of the nose, as though someone had taken her reflection and dressed it up in wealth and fame. This was Camille Rourke, the rising star whose face adorned billboards across the city, the celebrity fiancée that the Marchetti family had chosen for Lucian, and though Delaney had never laid eyes on her before, she felt as if she were staring at a stranger wearing her own skin, a living echo of the girl she had once been before life had carved its scars into her. The whispers around her grew bolder now, no longer bothering to hide their meaning, and Delaney caught the cruel edges of them as they drifted through the air. Look at her. She is the spitting image of Miss Rourke. Or is it the other way around? They say the boss chose that actress because she looks so much like a woman from his past. His first love, they call her. And now here that woman stands. So the rumors were true after all. Camille Rourke is nothing but a stand-in for a ghost. Each word landed like a small stone against Delaney's chest, and though her face betrayed nothing, inside her something twisted painfully, for she understood now with brutal clarity what her return had walked her into. A man who had cast her aside, yet surrounded himself with her likeness. A fiancé manufactured to resemble the very woman he claimed to have forgotten, and a family that had arranged this union like pieces on a chessboard, moving human hearts as easily as they moved money and power. Camille's gaze swept across the lobby with the practiced disdain of a queen surveying her court, and when it landed on Delaney, it lingered for a heartbeat too long, a flicker of something sharp and possessive crossing her beautiful features before she lifted her chin and swept past without a word. But that single look told Delaney everything she needed to know, that this woman had noticed the resemblance too, and that she saw in Delaney not a fellow employee, but a threat. Delaney forced herself to look away, to swallow the bitter tangle of emotions rising in her throat, and she reminded herself with fierce determination that she had not crossed an ocean to become entangled in the schemes of the Marchetti family, or to bleed her heart dry over a man who had ended their story with 4 cold words at an airport. She had come home for 3 reasons only: to reclaim the little bar that held the last warmth of her parents, to lift the shadow of disgrace from her father's name, and to break free of the debt that Marcus Fenn dangled over her like a blade. And once those things were done, she would walk away from this gilded world of lies with her head held high and never look back. Whatever Lucian felt, whatever games this family played, whatever ghost Camille Rourke had been created to replace, none of it was her concern, and she swore to herself that she would keep it that way, no matter how loudly the past called out to her from every corner of this cold and glittering tower. A few days later, the family announced a grand charity gala to be held in the name of the Marchetti Foundation, and every woman connected to the enterprise was expected to attend in her finest. So Delaney, needing a modest gown that would let her blend into the background rather than stand out, made her way to an upscale boutique that a colleague had mentioned offered garments for rent at a fraction of their purchase price. She moved quietly among the racks, her fingers brushing over fabrics far too expensive for her to ever own, and after much deliberation she settled on a simple gown of deep charcoal silk, elegant yet understated, the kind of dress that would let her disappear into the crowd and slip away when the night was done, and she carried it to the counter with the quiet relief of someone who had found exactly what she needed. But before the clerk could even ring up the rental, the doors of the boutique swung open, and the air itself seemed to shift. Camille Rourke swept in, trailed by a cluster of assistants, her presence commanding the entire room, and at her side, drawn along by the possessive grip of her hand on his arm, was Lucian Marchetti himself, his expression unreadable beneath the cold marble of his features. And the moment Camille's eyes fell upon Delaney standing at the counter with the charcoal gown in her hands, a slow, cruel smile curved across her painted lips. "Well now, look who it is," Camille said, her voice sweet as poison as she glided closer. "I did not realize this boutique had begun serving charity cases. And how curious that of all the dresses here you would reach for that one. Tell me, do you truly imagine you could wear something like that and belong in our world?" Delaney set the gown down with deliberate calm and met the other woman's gaze without flinching, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "I am not trying to belong to anyone's world. I came here to rent a dress and nothing more. If it offends you so deeply, then by all means take it. I have no interest in fighting over something that clearly means so much to you." Camille's smile faltered for the briefest instant before she recovered, turning toward Lucian with a practiced pout and wrapping herself tighter around his arm. "Lucian, darling, did you hear how she speaks to me, this little nobody your family dragged in off the street? Surely you will not let her humiliate your fiancé in public." All eyes turned to Lucian then, and Delaney forced herself to look at him too, her heart hammering against her ribs though her face gave nothing away, and for a long moment he said nothing, his gaze moving from Camille's petulant expression to the woman standing alone at the counter with her chin lifted and her worn coat wrapped around her thin frame. And when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and cold as a winter lake. "If the dress means so little to you, then there is no reason to make a scene over it. Let Miss Rourke have it and be done. Do not waste everyone's time on things that do not concern you." The words were meant to wound, and they did, but Delaney had spent 5 years learning how to bleed without letting anyone see, so she merely inclined her head with a bitter smile and answered softly, "Of course. I would never dream of taking something another person loves so dearly. It is all yours." And she stepped back from the counter and turned to leave. But in the half-second before she looked away, she caught something in Lucian's eyes that his cold words had not accounted for, a flicker of anguish so raw and fleeting that she almost thought she had imagined it, a tightening at the corner of his jaw, a shadow of pain crossing those glacial features before they froze over once more. She walked out of the boutique with her head held high, and her hands trembling at her sides, telling herself that the crack she had glimpsed in his armor was nothing more than a trick of the light, a fantasy conjured by a foolish heart that refused to let go, and yet the image of that fleeting look haunted her all the way down the street. For it did not match the man who had just discarded her so easily, and somewhere beneath the wreckage of her pride, a small, dangerous question began to stir. Why would a man who felt nothing for her look at her as though watching her walk away was tearing him apart from the inside? The night of the charity gala arrived, draped in gold and crystal, the grand ballroom of the Marchetti Foundation shimmering beneath chandeliers that scattered light like falling stars. And Delaney entered quietly in a plain borrowed gown, keeping to the edges of the room where she hoped to remain unnoticed among the glittering crowd of the city's most powerful and privileged. She had come only because attendance was expected, and she intended to fulfill that obligation and slip away before the night grew late. But fate had other plans, for it was not long before Camille Rourke found her, and this time the actress came not with wounded pouts, but with the confidence of a woman who knew she held every advantage. Camille approached with a glass of champagne in hand and a circle of admirers trailing behind her, and her voice rang out just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "My goodness, I did not expect the family's little charity project to actually show her face tonight. Tell me, dear, did you crawl here hoping to catch someone's eye? Or perhaps you thought that wearing a borrowed rag would somehow make you belong among real people?" A ripple of laughter passed through the small crowd, and Delaney felt the sting of a dozen judging stares, but before she could summon a reply, a new voice cut through the air with the authority of steel wrapped in silk, and the crowd instantly fell silent and parted, for approaching them was Vittoria Marchetti herself, the matriarch of the family, resplendent in dark velvet and diamonds, her silver hair swept up like a crown, and her eyes as sharp and cold as a blade honed for cutting. Vittoria came to stand beside Camille with a possessiveness that made her allegiance unmistakable, and she fixed Delaney with a look of glacial disdain before she spoke. "So you are the bookkeeper my son brought into the fold," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "I suppose I should thank you for your diligence with our accounts, but let me offer you a piece of advice that will serve you well. Know your place, girl. Camille is to be my daughter-in-law. The future of two great families rests upon her, and a woman like you, with your borrowed dresses and your buried past, would do well to remember that you are here to count numbers and nothing more. Do not let whatever foolish notions may be stirring in your head lead you to reach for things far above your station." The message could not have been clearer, and Delaney understood at once that in this family, Camille was no mere rival, but a chosen piece in a grand alliance, protected and elevated by the matriarch's own hand, while she herself was regarded as little more than dust to be swept aside. Yet she lowered her eyes and answered with quiet dignity, "You have nothing to fear from me, madam. I want no part of your alliances or your throne. I am here for my own reasons, and they have nothing to do with your son." It was then, in the taut silence that followed, that Lucien appeared at the edge of the gathering, and the moment his eyes swept across the scene, the atmosphere grew colder still, for when Camille turned to him with a triumphant smile and reached for his arm expecting his support, he stepped back just enough to keep her hand from finding purchase, his expression distant and unreadable, and he addressed her with a flatness that bordered on indifference. "Camille, this is a charity gala, not a stage for your theatrics. If you have nothing worthwhile to contribute, then I suggest you enjoy the evening quietly." The rebuke landed like a slap, and Camille's face flushed with humiliation, while Vittoria's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and Delaney, watching from a few steps away, felt a confusion bloom within her that was almost more painful than the insults. For here was a man who had publicly cast her aside, yet who now turned his coldness upon the very fiancé his mother championed. A man whose words and whose actions seemed to belong to two entirely different people. She looked at Lucien standing there so remote and untouchable, a stranger wearing the face of the boy she had once loved, and though her heart ached at how far away he seemed, that same strange contradiction gnawed at her once more, the growing sense that the ice he wore was a mask, and that beneath it something was fighting to break free. Not many days after the gala, business brought Camille Rourke into the Marchetti Tower once more, for her endorsement contract with one of the family's legitimate ventures was due for renewal, and the negotiations had been placed, to everyone's surprise, in the hands of Delaney herself, whose sharp mind for figures and contracts had already begun to earn quiet respect among the staff. Camille arrived at the conference room flanked by her manager, her chin high and her patience thin, and the moment she saw who sat waiting for her across the polished table, her expression curdled into open hostility. "So it is you again," she said, dropping into her seat with a disdainful flourish. "They truly expect me to discuss my contract with a glorified clerk. I only ever dealt with Lucian directly, and I certainly have no intention of letting some nobody who clawed her way in through the family's charity decide what my name is worth." Delaney folded her hands atop the neatly arranged documents before her and regarded the other woman with unshaken composure. "Miss Rourke, whether you like it or not, the terms of this contract fall under my department now, and if you wish to renew it, then we will discuss it properly. But if you came here only to insult me, then you are wasting both our time." Camille's eyes flashed, and she leaned forward, her voice rising shrill and venomous. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? I am the face of half this city's advertisements, while you are nothing but a penniless ghost, dressed in rented clothes. You think you can look down on me?" A cool smile touched Delaney's lips, and when she answered, her voice was soft yet cutting as glass. "I would never look down on you, Miss Rourke, but since you ask, let me be honest. You remind me of a cheap imitation, the kind that looks convincing enough from a distance, but the moment it opens its mouth, the whole illusion falls apart. So perhaps if you cannot conduct yourself with dignity, it would be wiser to say nothing at all." The manager beside Camille paled, and the actress shot to her feet with fury blazing across her face. But before she could unleash her rage, the door of the conference room opened without warning, and Lucian Marchetti stepped inside, his presence instantly silencing the room, and though no one had summoned him, he took in the scene with a single sweeping glance that missed nothing. Camille rushed to him at once, her voice cracking with performed distress. "Lucian, thank goodness you are here. This woman has been insulting me without mercy. She has no respect for me at all. You must do something about her." But Lucian's cold gaze did not soften as it settled upon his fiancée, and when he spoke his words fell like a blade. "This is a place of business, Camille, not a playground for your tantrums. From what I heard as I entered it was you who came looking for a fight, and I will not have you disrupting my company's affairs with your childishness. If you cannot behave professionally, then apologize to Miss Hale and conduct yourself accordingly, or leave." A stunned silence fell over the room, and Camille stared at him in disbelief, her face draining of color, for never had she imagined he would take the side of a mere bookkeeper over her, and with her lip trembling and her pride in ruins, she forced out a strangled apology, before fleeing the room in humiliation, her manager scrambling after her. Delaney remained frozen in her seat, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the confrontation, because this made no sense at all. A man who had thrown her away at the airport, who had let his fiancée mock her at a boutique and a gala without lifting a finger, had now inexplicably stepped forward to shield her in front of witnesses, and the contradiction gnawed at her more fiercely than ever. She lifted her eyes to find him already watching her, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with unspoken things, before he turned on his heel and walked out without a word of explanation, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her certainty. She had returned to Chicago convinced that she knew exactly who Lucian Marchetti had become, a cold and heartless stranger who felt nothing for her, but with every passing day that conviction cracked a little further. And now, for the first time, she found herself truly wondering whether the man behind the ice was someone else entirely, someone she did not yet understand. The alliance between the Marchetti family and the Rourke camp had been built upon carefully orchestrated appearances, and among the most important of these was a lavish joint reception planned for that week. An event where Lucian and Camille were expected to stand together before the cameras and the heads of allied families, presenting themselves as the golden couple whose union would seal a partnership worth more than anyone could count. And Vittoria had spent weeks arranging every detail with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Camille had been counting on that evening to repair the humiliation she had suffered, and to remind the world that she was the chosen bride of the most powerful man in Chicago. And so when word reached her that Lucian had abruptly canceled his attendance, she was beside herself with disbelief and rage. But the reason for his absence was what truly set the ground trembling beneath the family's carefully laid plans. On the very afternoon of the reception, a complication had arisen with one of the family's clean holding companies, a tangle in the ledgers that Delaney had flagged as suspicious, and rather than delegate the matter to any of his numerous subordinates, Lucian had chosen to remain behind and address it personally. Sitting late into the evening in a quiet office, with Delaney at his side, as they combed through the accounts together. And while to any outsider it looked like nothing more than a diligent executive attending to urgent business, the truth was that he had seized upon the excuse to be near her, to watch her work, to study the shadows beneath her eyes, and the careful way she guarded herself, searching for the answers that still eluded him about the 5 years that had hollowed her out. Word of this did not stay hidden for long, and when it reached the Marchetti estate, that Lucian had thrown away a critical alliance event to bury himself in paperwork alongside the new bookkeeper, Vittoria set down her teacup with a slow, deliberate click that betrayed the first crack in her composure. She had dismissed the girl entirely at first, had waved away her son's decision to hire her as nothing more than a practical arrangement, but now for the first time, a cold thread of unease began to wind its way through her sharp and calculating mind. For Lucian did not neglect his duties, he did not cancel alliances, he did not choose the company of a lowly clerk over the political theater that kept the family's power intact, and yet he had done all three in a single evening. She sat alone in the dim opulence of her drawing room, turning the matter over with growing suspicion, recalling now the strange rebuke he had delivered to Camille at the gala, the way he had shielded the bookkeeper in front of witnesses, the peculiar attentiveness he had shown to a woman who should have been beneath his notice, and one by one these small oddities that she had overlooked began to assemble themselves into a picture she did not like at all. Who exactly was this Delaney Hale, she wondered, and why did the name stir something at the very edge of her memory? Why did the girl's presence unsettle her son in ways that no ordinary employee ever could? And though she could not yet name the danger, she felt certain that a danger existed, that something threatened the alliance she had labored so long to secure, and Vittoria Marchetti had not clawed her way to the summit of a criminal empire by ignoring the whisper of a threat. She rose from her chair and moved to the tall windows overlooking the darkened grounds, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, and as she gazed out into the night, a resolve began to harden within her. For whatever was quietly taking root between her son and that girl, she would not sit idle and allow it to bloom. She would uncover exactly who Delaney Hale was, and what hold she had over Lucian, and she would tear it out by the root before it could poison everything she had built. The first seeds of her interference had been planted, and in the silence of that grand and lonely room, the matriarch made a quiet vow to herself, that no penniless nobody would be allowed to unravel the future of the Marchetti name, and that if her son would not protect the alliance, then she would protect it for him, by whatever means proved necessary. What no one at the Marchetti Tower knew was that when Delaney's long days of managing the family's accounts came to an end, her nights had only just begun, for the salary of a bookkeeper, however respectable, could never hope to swallow the crushing debt that Marcus Fenn held over her. And so several evenings a week she slipped quietly into a uniform and took up part-time work cleaning the rooms of a luxury hotel across the city, laboring in the shadows long after the sun had set, her hands raw and her body aching, hiding this second life from everyone she knew, because the last thing her battered pride could bear was pity. It was on one such night, as she pushed her cart down a dimly lit corridor on an upper floor, that fate led her toward a trap she never saw coming, for behind one of the suite doors a scheme had been carefully arranged, and the architect of it was none other than Camille Rourke, who had learned of Delaney's secret nighttime work and seen in it the perfect opportunity to rid herself of the woman she despised. Camille had conspired with a group of reckless young men from wealthy families, promising them favors and connections in exchange for cornering Delaney where no one would hear, intending to stage a scandal that would destroy what little reputation the bookkeeper had left. And when Delaney was summoned to that particular suite, under the pretense of a cleaning request, she stepped inside only to find the door lock click shut behind her, and several leering figures rising from their seats. Her heart seized with alarm as she understood at once that she had walked into something sinister, and though fear clawed at her throat, she lifted her chin and kept her voice steady. Whatever you have been paid to do, you should think very carefully before you make a mistake you cannot undo. But the men only laughed and began to close in, confident that this friendless woman was theirs to torment, and Delaney backed toward the wall, her mind racing for any way out of the closing circle. Yet in that moment, when hope seemed to abandon her, the door to the suite burst open with a force that rattled the frame, and Lucien Marchetti stood in the doorway, and the temperature of the entire room seemed to plunge in an instant, for the man who filled that space was not the cold and distant executive of the office, but something far more dangerous, the true face of the boss whom the entire city feared, his eyes burning with a lethal calm that promised ruin. The young men who had felt so bold a moment before went pale as death when they recognized who had come, and one by one they stumbled back, stammering apologies, for they knew all too well that to have laid a hand on someone under this man's protection was to have signed away their own futures, and Lucien did not need to raise his voice or lift his hand. He simply looked at each of them in turn with that terrible quiet, and spoke a single low sentence that carried the weight of a death sentence. "You have no idea what you have just done." Within moments his men had swept in behind him. Im and the cowering figures were removed from the room, their arrogance dissolved into terror. And then at last, Lucien's gaze fell upon Delaney, standing there in her cleaning uniform, with her hands trembling, and exhaustion carved into every line of her face, and something inside him fractured. He had known she carried debt, had sensed that something was wrong, but seeing her like this, worn down to the bone, and laboring in secret through the night while danger stalked her in the dark, struck him with a force that no report and no suspicion could have prepared him for, and in that instant, the comfortable lie he had believed for 2 years shattered completely, the lie that Delaney was thriving, that she was happy, that she had built a good life across the ocean. This was no life of comfort. This was a woman fighting to survive against forces that were grinding her down, and as he stared at her, the vague unease that had haunted him since the airport crystallized into a cold and furious resolve, for he no longer merely suspected that he had been deceived, he was certain of it, and he swore in the silence of his own heart that he would uncover every truth that had been hidden from him about these 5 years, no matter who had buried it, or how deep. The rescue at the hotel did not remain a secret for long within a family whose eyes and ears reached into every corner of the city, and when the tale of it reached Vittoria, distorted by the whispers of those who carried it, the matriarch summoned her son to a formal dinner at the estate that very week, determined to confront the growing wrongness she sensed festering beneath the surface of his behavior. The long dining table gleamed beneath the soft light of the chandelier, the finest china and crystal laid out in perfect array, but the air between mother and son was taut as a drawn wire, and Vittoria wasted little time on pleasantries, setting down her wineglass and fixing Lucien with a piercing stare. "I have heard some deeply troubling things," she began, her voice smooth but sharp. "They tell me you abandoned an alliance reception to sit over ledgers with that bookkeeper, and now they tell me you went charging across the city in the dead of night to rescue her from some sordid trouble of her own making. Tell me, Lucien, have you lost all sense of who you are and what this family requires of you?" Lucien met her gaze without flinching, his expression carved from the same cold marble as her own, and he answered with a calm that only deepened her unease. "I attend to what requires my attention, mother, and I will not apologize for ensuring that a member of my staff was not harmed under my own watch." But Vittoria's eyes narrowed and she leaned forward, her rings glinting as her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "Do not insult me by pretending this is about staff. No man neglects the future of two great families for a mere clerk. No boss soils his hands rescuing a nobody who cleans hotel rooms at night. There is something between you and this Delaney Hale, and I will know what it is." At the sound of that name spoken aloud with such venom, something flickered dangerously in Lucian's eyes, but he kept his voice level as he set down his own glass and delivered the words that would reshape the battlefield. "If you are so concerned about the future of the family, mother, then perhaps you should concern yourself with substance, rather than appearances. Camille Rourke is a decoration. Nothing more. A face for the cameras with no worth beyond her looks, and if a woman is to hold any true place beside me, she must prove herself capable of standing on her own, of earning her position through her own ability, rather than being handed it like a prize. And Delaney Hale has done more genuine work for this family in a matter of weeks than your celebrated bride has done in a year." The words landed like a thrown gauntlet, and Vittoria understood their meaning at once, that her son was not merely defending the bookkeeper, but elevating her, holding her up as a standard against the very bride the matriarch had chosen, and a cold fury rose within her, even as she kept her face composed. "So this is how it is," she said softly. "You would place some penniless stranger above the alliance I have built with my own hands, over the marriage that secures our power for a generation." And Lucian answered with quiet finality, "I am saying that worth should be earned, not inherited through schemes. And if that troubles you, then perhaps it is the schemes that deserve your scrutiny, not me." The dinner ended in frigid silence, neither yielding an inch, and long after Lucian had gone, Vittoria remained alone at the head of the empty table, her mind working with the cold precision that had kept her alive in a world that devoured the weak. For she now understood beyond any doubt that Delaney Hale was no ordinary employee, that her son harbored feelings for this woman that threatened everything, and that the vague unease she had first felt had ripened into a clear and present danger. She would not confront the matter openly, not yet, for she had learned long ago that the surest way to destroy an enemy was first to understand them, and so that very night she gave quiet orders to her most trusted people, instructing them to dig into every corner of Delaney Hale's past, to trace the 5 years she had spent abroad, to uncover every debt and secret and shame the girl had buried, for somewhere in that hidden history Vittoria was certain she would find the weapon she needed. She did not yet know what her investigators would unearth, nor how the threads of the past would tangle with the deepest secrets of her own family, but as she sat alone in the shadows of that grand and silent hall, the matriarch resolved with icy determination to reclaim control of her son and her empire, whatever the cost, and to remove the woman she now saw as the single greatest threat to the world she ruled. While Vittoria set her own investigators loose upon Delaney's past, Lucian had already begun a search of his own, driven by the shattering realization at the hotel that everything he had believed about her life abroad was a lie, and he demanded from his people every scrap of truth about the 5 years that had turned the bright girl he remembered into the hollow-eyed woman who now haunted his every waking thought. Piece by painful piece the true story assembled itself before him, and each revelation cut deeper than the last, for the reports told of a young woman who had arrived in London with nothing but grief and a dying mother, who had watched that mother slip away within months, as the little money they had drained into hospital bills that bought only a few more weeks of borrowed time, and who had then found herself utterly alone in a foreign city, buried beneath debt and stripped of every comfort. Yet she had not surrendered, the reports revealed. She had clawed her way forward through sheer will, working herself to exhaustion by day and studying by night, until she earned a place at a respected university, rebuilding herself from the ruins with a strength that stunned even the hardened men who compiled the account. But it was what came after that made Lucian's hands tighten into fists as he read, for it was then that a man named Marcus Fenn had entered her life. Fenn was a gallery owner in name and a predatory moneylender in truth, a man who preyed upon the vulnerable and the desperate, and he had set his sights upon Delaney with the patience of a spider, first offering her the loans she needed to survive, and then tightening the web around her until she could not escape. And when she refused to bend to the true price he demanded of her, a price no decent person should ever have to pay, he had destroyed her with a lie, fabricating an accusation that she had stolen and plagiarized work that was rightfully her own, using his connections and his money to see her cast out in disgrace, and saddled with a debt that would shackle her for years. The flashback of those days lived in Delaney's memory like an open wound, the humiliation of being branded a thief when she was the victim, the cold satisfaction in Fenn's eyes as he watched her fall, the way the world had believed his fabrications because he was powerful and she was nothing, and she had carried that injustice across the ocean because she had no other choice, the debt following her home like a shadow that refused to fade. Even now, in the small quiet of the restored bar late one evening, that shadow reached out to touch her, for her phone rang with a number she recognized all too well, and when she answered, Marcus Fenn's oily voice slithered down the line. "So you have settled comfortably back in Chicago, have you? Cozy in your little life, but do not imagine for a moment that distance changes anything. You still owe me $800,000, and I intend to collect every cent, and I wonder how your new employers would feel if they learned about the criminal record hanging over your pretty head." Delaney's grip tightened on the phone, but though her heart pounded, she refused to let him hear a single tremor of fear in her voice. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her tone cold and unyielding. "I will pay back every last dollar I owe you, not because I am afraid of you, and not because your threats mean anything to me, but because I want to erase every trace of you from my life and never have to breathe the same air as a man like you again. So send me whatever figures you like. I will settle the debt, and then you and I are finished forever." Fenn laughed softly, unimpressed by her defiance, and reminded her that she had 1 month to produce a substantial payment or he would ensure her ruin. But Delaney ended the call before he could finish, standing alone in the dim light of her father's bar with her jaw set and her eyes burning, for she had survived this man once, and she would not let him break her a second time. What she did not know was that Lucian had just finished reading the very account of what Fenn had done to her, and that as he set down those pages, the cold fury within him had hardened into something absolute, a silent promise that the man who had preyed upon her would answer for every cruelty, and that never again would she face such darkness alone, whether she knew he stood behind her or not. It happened by accident, the way the most devastating truths so often do, on an evening when Lucian had been caught in a sudden downpour, and shrugged off his soaked jacket in the office he shared a wall with, draping it over the back of a chair before being called away to an urgent matter, and Delaney, passing through to return a stack of files, noticed the jacket beginning to slip and reached instinctively to catch it before it fell. As she lifted it, something small and hard shifted within the breast pocket, sliding partway out, and when she caught it in her palm to tuck it safely back, her whole body went rigid, for resting in her hand was a small wooden charm, worn smooth by years of handling, its carved surface faded but unmistakable, because she had made it herself with her own trembling hands a lifetime ago and pressed it into the palm of the boy she loved, as a promise before the world tore them apart. She stood frozen, unable to breathe, staring at the object she had believed lost forever, the little talisman she had assumed he had thrown away the moment he cast her aside, and yet here it was, carried against his chest over his heart, through 5 long years, and every cold word he had spoken to her, and her mind reeled as the foundation of everything she had believed about him began to crack beneath her feet. With her heart hammering, she noticed that the pocket held something more, and drawing it out with shaking fingers, she found a small worn photograph, its edges softened by countless touches, and in it were 2 young people laughing in the sunlight outside her father's bar, herself and Lucian in the days when their love had been simple and whole, an image she had thought existed only in her own fading memory, kept all this time by a man who claimed to feel nothing. The pieces she had refused to assemble now came crashing together in her mind, and a memory surfaced that she had buried beneath years of bitterness. The memory of a day long ago, when she had been certain she would have to abandon her education because there was no money left. When a teacher had told her that an anonymous benefactor had stepped forward to pay her tuition so that she could continue her studies, a mystery she had never solved and had eventually stopped questioning in the chaos of everything else that had befallen her, and now with sudden terrible clarity she understood who that silent benefactor had been. It had been him, always him, quietly reaching into her life from a distance to lift her while pretending to have discarded her. And the image she had carried of Lucian Marchetti as a heartless philanderer who had used her and thrown her away, shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by something far more painful and far more complicated, a man who had wounded her with cruel words, yet had never stopped loving her in secret. She sank into the nearest chair, the charm and photograph clutched to her chest, and tears she had held back for years spilled down her cheeks as she struggled to reconcile the two impossible truths, that he had pushed her away, and that he had never let her go. And slowly, a fragile understanding began to take shape, for she realized that his abandonment and his devotion were not contradictions, but two halves of the same unbearable sacrifice. He had released his hold on her in every visible way, had stepped back from her life, and let her believe he no longer cared, and she would later come to understand that he had done so believing she was safe and happy, somewhere far from the dangers of his world. But he had never been able to release his heart, and so while his hands had let her go, his soul had kept these small relics of her close, carrying them like a wound that would not heal, a love he could neither act upon nor extinguish. In that moment, sitting alone in the quiet office with the rain streaking down the windows and the evidence of his hidden heart pressed against her own, Delaney felt the careful walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. For it was one thing to hate a man who had betrayed her, and another thing entirely to face the shattering truth that the man she had tried so hard to hate had loved her all along, and that somewhere in the tangle of pride and pain and secrets that separated them lay a story neither of them had fully understood. As Lucian pored over the full account of Delaney's ruin in London, a discrepancy began to gnaw at him that he could not ignore, for the timeline of her suffering did not align with what he had been told, and the more closely he examined the dates, the more a cold dread settled into his chest. Because the very years when Delaney had been drowning in debt and torment at the hands of Marcus Fenn were the same years during which Enzo had assured him, again and again, that she was flourishing, that she had built a good life, that she had found happiness and moved on without him. For the first 3 years the reports had matched the truth, describing her grief and her struggle and her fierce climb toward a new beginning. But somewhere in the 4th year the accounts had shifted, painting a portrait of contentment and success, precisely when the real Delaney had been sinking into her darkest hour, and Lucian understood with mounting fury that this was no error, no failure of information, but a deliberate deception woven by the one man he had trusted above all others. He summoned Enzo to his office that night, and when his most loyal lieutenant stepped through the door, Lucian was standing at the window with his back turned, the two sets of reports laid side by side upon the desk, and his voice when he spoke was deadly quiet. "Tell me, Enzo, how does a woman who is thriving and happy end up cleaning hotel rooms at midnight to pay off a debt to a man who destroyed her? How do the words in these reports match the woman I pulled out of that suite?" Enzo's face drained of color as he saw the papers, and for a long moment he said nothing, his silence a confession in itself. And when at last he spoke, his voice was heavy with a guilt he could no longer hide. "Boss, I did what I believed was right. I did it for you." And Lucian turned then, his eyes blazing with a cold that was worse than any shout. "Explain yourself, before I forget how many years you have stood at my side." Enzo lowered his gaze and the truth poured out of him at last. "For the first 3 years I told you everything as it was, and I watched what it did to you. You did not eat. You did not sleep. You were a man being hollowed out from the inside by a longing you would not allow yourself to act upon. And you are the boss. The whole family looks to you. An empire rests upon your shoulders, and a man who cannot stop staring across an ocean at a shadow cannot lead. So I made a choice. I began to tell you she was happy, that she had moved on, that she was living a good life, because I believed that if you thought she was safe and content, you could finally let her go and become whole again. I wanted to set you free. The confession struck Lucian like a physical blow, and he gripped the edge of the desk as the full weight of what had been done crashed over him. For while he had believed her safe and had stepped back from watching over her, she had been falling into a nightmare, and his protection had been withdrawn at the precise moment she needed it most. All because a lie told out of misguided devotion had blinded him to her suffering. But there was more, and Lucian saw it in the way Enzo hesitated, in the flicker of fear that crossed his face, and he pressed with lethal calm. You did not do this alone. Someone helped you. Someone with the reach to feed you false information, and the motive to keep me from her. Tell me who. And Enzo, knowing there was no path left but the truth, bowed his head and gave the name that Lucian had already begun to dread. It was your mother, boss. Vittoria came to me and offered her support. She wanted you free of Delaney as much as I believed you needed to be, and together we made certain the reports told you what would let you move on. The silence that followed was absolute, and in it, Lucian felt the vague unease that had haunted him since the moment he saw Delaney at the airport finally crystallize into a devastating and unbearable truth. That the woman he loved had been abandoned to the wolves, not by chance but by design. That his own mother and his own most trusted man had conspired to sever him from her, and had left her defenseless in the doing. And as the enormity of the betrayal settled into his bones, his grief hardened into something far more dangerous, a cold and burning resolve. For now he understood the true shape of what had been taken from them both, and he knew at last exactly whom he had to face. Delaney could no longer carry the weight of what she had discovered in silence, and so she came to him that night, with the wooden charm clutched in her hand, finding him alone in the dim quiet of his office, and when he turned to see her standing in the doorway, with tears already glistening in her eyes, and the little talisman held out toward him like an accusation, he knew at once that the walls between them were about to fall. Why? She asked, her voice trembling with everything she had held back for 5 years. Why do you still have this? Why did you keep our photograph over your heart all this time? Why did you pay for my education in secret, while telling me I was nothing but a game to you? If I meant so little, then explain to me why a man who feels nothing would carry a piece of me against his chest through all these years. And Lucian, who had faced down enemies and death without flinching, found that he could not meet the raw pain in her eyes without his own composure crumbling. He crossed the room slowly and stopped before her, and when he spoke his voice was low and rough with an emotion he had buried for half a decade. Because everything I told you that night was a lie, Delaney. Every cruel word was a lie I forced myself to speak because it was the only way to make you leave, and I needed you to leave. I needed you gone from this city and far from me. Because 5 years ago this family was locked in a war with the Kovacs syndicate, a war that would have used you against me the instant they learned what you meant to me. They would have taken you, hurt you, killed you to break me, and I could not let that happen. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made you hate me enough to run. The tears spilled freely down Delaney's face now, as the last of her illusions dissolved, and Lucian's own control finally broke as he reached out and gently took the charm from her open palm, his hand closing around it, and around her fingers, and I told myself it was worth it. He continued, his voice fracturing. I told myself that if you were far away and safe, then I could endure anything. Even your hatred, even a lifetime of watching you from a distance. But I did not know, Delaney. I swear to you I did not know what they let happen to you over there. I believed you were safe. I believed you were happy. I was told you had built a good life and moved on. And I let myself believe it because the alternative was unbearable. And all the while you were suffering, alone, hunted by a monster, and I was not there. His confession broke something open in her. and she understood at last that his cruelty had been a shield, and his abandonment an act of desperate love. That the man she had spent years hating had sacrificed his own heart to keep hers beating, and that the very protection meant to save her had been stolen from her by lies told behind his back, and the grief and relief of it overwhelmed her all at once. "I hated you," she whispered. "I hated you for so long. I built my whole survival on hating you, and now you are telling me that all of it, everything I endured, was because you loved me too much to keep me close." And Lucian pressed her hand tighter around the charm they now held together, his forehead lowering until it nearly touched hers. "I would do it again to keep you alive," he said softly. "But I would give anything to have spared you the pain, anything, and the guilt of what my silence cost you will follow me to my grave." For a long moment they simply stood there, two people who had been torn apart by love disguised as betrayal, finally seeing each other clearly across the ruins of all that had separated them. And then Delaney did the thing she had sworn she would never do again. She let herself lean into him, resting her weary head against his chest, where the charm had lived for 5 years, and his arms closed around her at last, holding her as though she might vanish if he let go. There, in the quiet dark, amid all the wreckage of secrets and lies and stolen years, there bloomed a single fragile moment of sweetness, the first they had shared since the night he sent her away, a tender and trembling peace that felt like coming home. And for that brief precious, while neither of them spoke of the dangers still gathering around them, of the mother who had betrayed them, or the secret about her father that still lay buried, they only held one another and breathed, allowing themselves to believe, if only for a heartbeat, that love might yet be enough to save them both. With the truth of the past finally laid bare between them, Lucian turned the full force of his power toward those who had preyed upon the woman he loved, and he moved with the cold precision of a man who had waited far too long to act, beginning with Camille Rourke, whose cruelty at the hotel he had neither forgotten nor forgiven. The reckoning came swiftly and without mercy, for Lucian severed every thread that had bound the actress to the Marchetti empire, canceling her contracts, withdrawing the vast resources that had lifted her fragile fame into the spotlight, and quietly ensuring that the doors of the entertainment world she had clawed her way into now closed against her one by one. And when Camille came storming into the tower in a fury of disbelief, demanding to see him, demanding an explanation, she found only Enzo waiting to deliver the boss's message, that she had been given more chances than she deserved and had squandered every one, and that a woman who would conspire to harm an innocent to satisfy her own jealousy had earned the ruin now falling upon her. Camille raged and pleaded and threatened, her carefully painted composure dissolving into desperation, as she realized that the empire which had made her was now unmaking her, that the power she had wielded so arrogantly had never truly been hers at all, and in the end, she was escorted from the tower a diminished and broken figure. Her schemes collapsed to dust, her name already fading from the billboards that had once made her a queen, and though Delaney felt no joy in another's downfall, she could not deny a quiet sense of justice in watching the woman who had tried to destroy her reap the consequences of her own malice. But it was upon Marcus Fenn that Lucian's judgment fell hardest, for the gallery owner had done far more than threaten Delaney. He had built his fortune upon the ruin of the vulnerable, and Lucian had spent his resources uncovering every buried crime the man had committed across the years, the fraud, the predatory schemes, the trail of victims he had silenced with money and fear, and one by one these long-hidden truths were pulled into the light and placed into the hands of those who could see justice done. Fenn, who had believed himself untouchable, who had laughed at Delaney's defiance and dangled her debt over her like a blade, found the ground vanishing beneath his feet as the evidence of his crimes surfaced, and the law he had evaded for so long finally closed its grip around him. And when at last he understood who stood behind his sudden downfall, he tried in vain to bargain, to threaten, to call in favors that no longer existed, but the machinery of his ruin had already been set in motion, and there was no stopping it, and the man who had preyed upon the desperate would now spend his remaining years answering for every life he had shattered. The debt that had shackled Delaney for so long dissolved along with him, lifted from her shoulders like a chain finally struck away, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt she could breathe without the shadow of that man darkening every horizon. And as she stood in the restored warmth of her father's bar one evening, watching the golden light spill across the counter he had once polished, she allowed herself to believe that the storm of her life had finally passed. Her debt was gone. Her tormentor was fallen. The man she loved had returned to her, not as the cold stranger she had feared, but as the devoted heart she had lost. And the future that had seemed so hopeless now shimmered with a fragile new promise. And she pressed her hand to her chest where a lightness had settled that she had not felt in longer than she could remember, daring at last to imagine a life of peace. Yet even as she stood there wrapped in that tender hope, she did not know that the cruelest blow was still to come, that the calm she was savoring was merely the stillness before the greatest storm of all, for in the shadows of the Marchetti estate, her enemy was not finished, and Vittoria Marchetti, cornered and desperate, and armed with a secret buried for 5 long years, was preparing to unleash a weapon capable of tearing Delaney and Lucian apart more completely than any lie or scheme had yet managed to do, and the peace Delaney had only just begun to trust was about to shatter in her hands. Vittoria Marchetti had watched her every scheme crumble, her chosen bride cast out, her manipulation of Enzo exposed, her son slipping beyond her control and into the arms of the very woman she had fought so hard to banish. And cornered as she was, she reached for the one weapon she had held in reserve for 5 long years, the deadliest arrow in her quiver, a truth so poisonous that she knew it could destroy what no lie had managed to touch. She summoned Delaney to the estate, under a pretense of reconciliation, and when the younger woman arrived wary but willing to hear her out, Vittoria received her not with the venom of before, but with a terrible calculated calm, offering her a seat and studying her with cold eyes before she began to speak. "So my son has told you a great many things, has he? About how he sent you away to protect you, about the war with the Kovac syndicate, about his undying love. How touching it all must sound. But I wonder, child, did he ever tell you the truth about how your father died?" At the mention of her father, Delaney went utterly still, and Vittoria saw the crack she had aimed for and drove her arrow deep, leaning forward with the merciless precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning where to wound. "Your father did not die by accident, Delaney. Your father died because of this family. Because of the world my son and I command. He was our bookkeeper. He knew too much, and when his knowledge became inconvenient, it was the Marchetti name that sealed his fate. The man you now share a bed with belongs to the very family that put your father in the ground, and every tender word he has whispered to you has been built upon that grave." The words landed like a blade driven straight through Delaney's heart, and the room seemed to tilt around her as the fragile peace she had only just begun to trust splintered into nothing, for Vittoria had wrapped her lie in just enough truth to make it unbearable. Her father had indeed worked for this family. He had indeed died under circumstances she had never fully understood, and now the matriarch was telling her that the shadow of his death led directly to the man she loved. She wanted to scream that it could not be true, that Vittoria was lying, that this was simply one more cruel scheme, but the seed of doubt had already taken root and begun to poison everything, because how could she be certain? How could she trust anything in a world built on secrets and manipulation? And the horror of the possibility that she had given her heart to a man whose family had destroyed her father was more than her wounded soul could bear. Vittoria pressed her advantage without mercy, her voice dropping to a silken whisper. "Ask yourself, child, why a powerful family would ever concern itself with the fate of a lowly bookkeeper's daughter? Why my son would go to such lengths to keep you close? Perhaps it is guilt that drives him. Perhaps every kindness he has shown you is nothing more than a murderer trying to soothe his own conscience. And how can you lie in the arms of the son while the blood of your father stains his family's hands?" Delaney rose from her chair on trembling legs, her face pale as death and her eyes brimming with a grief and fury she could barely contain, and she fled the estate without another word, her mind a storm of anguish and betrayal. And when she found Lucian waiting for her, when she saw the tenderness in his eyes turn to alarm at the sight of her distress, all the accusations poured out of her in a torrent of pain. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Is it true that your family killed my father? That everything between us has been built on his grave? Tell me it is a lie. Tell me your mother was lying." And Lucian, blindsided and stricken, could only stare at her in shock. For he had never known the full truth of Thomas Hale's death, had never been told the circumstances, and in his hesitation, in the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face as he grappled with a question he could not immediately answer, Delaney read the confirmation she had dreaded most. She backed away from him with tears streaming down her face, shaking her head as the last of her hope collapsed. "Do not come near me," she whispered. "Do not touch me. I cannot look at you." And she turned and ran from him into the night, leaving Lucian standing alone with his heart in ruins. Both of them torn apart once more, just as they had found their way back to each other, victims yet again of a truth twisted into a weapon, and neither of them yet knowing that the real story of Thomas Hale's death was something no one in that family had dared to speak aloud. Believing that Delaney's flight had finally driven the wedge she needed between her son and the woman she despised, Vittoria moved to consolidate her victory, and she called together the senior members of the family to a formal gathering in the great hall of the estate, intending to force Lucian to publicly choose between the empire she had helped him build and the bookkeeper's daughter who had bewitched him, confident that faced with such a choice her son would bow at last to the demands of blood and power. When the family had assembled beneath the towering portraits of Marchetti ancestors, Vittoria took her place at the head of the hall and delivered her ultimatum with the cold authority of a woman who had ruled from the shadows for decades. "The time has come to put an end to this madness," she declared. "My son has allowed a penniless outsider to cloud his judgment and threaten everything this family stands for. And so I say to him now, before all of you, choose. Choose the family and the future we have sacrificed everything to secure, or choose that woman and watch me tear this empire apart with my own hands rather than see it fall into ruin, for I would sooner dissolve all we have built than surrender it to the whims of a lovesick fool." A heavy silence gripped the hall, and every eye turned to Lucian, who rose slowly from his seat and faced his mother with a composure that did not waver. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room with the weight of absolute certainty. "For 30 years I have been the son you demanded I be," he said. "I studied what you told me to study. I abandoned the friends you disapproved of. I bent my life to your designs, and swallowed my own desires again and again to serve this family. And there was only ever one thing I refused to surrender, one thing I would not let you take from me, and that is Delaney. 5 years ago I could not defy you, but I am not that helpless man anymore. And if you force me to choose, then know that my choice will always be her, today and for the rest of my life." Vittoria's face hardened, but before she could unleash her fury, Lucian continued, his eyes now blazing with the cold fire of a man who had uncovered a betrayal he would not forgive. "And since you have gathered the family to speak of loyalty and truth, Mother, let us speak of yours. Let them all hear how for the past 2 years you conspired with Enzo, my most trusted man, to feed me lies about the woman I loved, how you paid to have him tell me she was happy, and safe, and thriving, so that I would let go of her, so that I would abandon my watch over her, and how because of your scheme, she was left defenseless to be preyed upon, and nearly destroyed by a monster, while I believed her at peace." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled family, and Vittoria's composure cracked visibly as her private machinations were dragged into the light before the very people she had sought to command. And Lucian pressed on without mercy. "You speak of what threatens this family, but it was you who manipulated its heir. You who betrayed your own son. You who nearly cost an innocent woman her life to satisfy your obsession with control. So do not stand before them and cast Delaney as the danger, when the true poison in this house has always been your need to bend every heart around you to your will." The matriarch, who had never in her life been publicly challenged, least of all by the son she had shaped and commanded, found herself suddenly exposed and unsteady, her authority visibly trembling as the family looked upon her with new and uncertain eyes. And for the first time Lucian saw something in his mother's face that he had never witnessed before. A flicker of fear, of doubt, of a woman realizing that the ground she had always stood upon so surely was beginning to give way beneath her. "I have spent my whole life obeying you," he said more quietly now, "but I will not let you destroy her, and I will not let you rewrite the truth to serve your purposes any longer. Whatever secret you are hiding about her father, whatever poison you whispered into her ear to drive her from me, I will uncover it. And when I do, your lies will not survive the light." And with those words hanging in the air, he turned and strode from the hall, leaving Vittoria standing alone before the family she had ruled, her certainty shaken, her power fractured, and the first true tremor of consequence beginning to move through the empire she had spent a lifetime holding in her grip. Driven by the vow he had made before the entire family, Lucian threw every resource he possessed into uncovering the truth about Thomas Hale's death, refusing to rest until he had torn away the veil his mother had drawn over it, and his search led him at last to an old and faithful retainer of the family, a man who had served in the shadows during those violent years of the war with the Kovac syndicate, and who had kept his silence out of loyalty and grief until the day the young master came to him demanding the truth. The old man led Lucian to a sealed strongbox that Thomas had entrusted to him long ago, with instructions to open it only if the truth were ever needed to protect his daughter, and within it lay the answer that would change everything, a bundle of documents, and a letter written in Thomas Hale's own careful hand. And as Lucian read the words his father's bookkeeper had left behind, the true story of that fateful night finally emerged from the darkness where it had been buried for 5 long years. Thomas Hale had not died because the Marchetti family wished it, the letter revealed, but because he had chosen to die rather than betray them, for in those days the Kovac syndicate had been closing in, desperate to destroy the Marchetti empire, and they had discovered that the quiet, unassuming bookkeeper held in his mind and his ledgers the keys to everything. The identities, the accounts, the secrets that could bring the whole family crashing down, and so they had seized him, and they had made their demands, ordering him to surrender all that he knew, and threatening that if he refused, they would turn their attention to the one thing he loved more than his own life, his daughter Delaney. Faced with that impossible choice, Thomas had understood that as long as he lived and held those secrets, his daughter would remain a target, a piece to be used against him and against the family he had served with such devotion, and so he had made the only choice a father and a man of honor could make. He had refused to speak. He had taken every secret to his grave, and he had gone to his death willingly to ensure that the Kovac syndicate could never use him or harm his child, sacrificing himself so that both the family and his beloved daughter would be safe. When Lucian brought this truth to Delaney, laying before her the letter written in her father's own hand, along with the testimony of the old retainer who had witnessed those terrible days, she read the words through a veil of tears, and the grief and rage that Vittoria's poison had planted within her slowly gave way to a shattering and overwhelming understanding. For her father had not been a victim murdered by the family she loved. He had been a hero who had laid down his life to protect her, and the Marchetti name that Vittoria had painted as the author of his death was in truth the cause he had died to defend. The revelation broke something open inside her and healed it in the same moment. For all these years she had carried the belief that her father's death was a tragedy, shrouded in shame and mystery, a stain upon his name that she had crossed an ocean to cleanse, and now she understood that his death had been an act of profound love and courage, that the man who had wiped down the counter of his little bar with a towel over his shoulder had also been brave enough to face death itself, so that his daughter might live, and that Vittoria had known this truth all along, and had twisted it into a lie for the sole purpose of tearing Delaney away from Lucian. She wept then, not only for her loss, but for her father's sacrifice finally understood, pressing the letter to her heart, as 5 years of misplaced grief and buried anger dissolved into a fierce and aching pride, and she realized with piercing clarity that the man she loved was innocent of the crime his mother had laid at his feet, that the family had not stolen her father, but had been the very thing he gave his life to save, and that the wall Vittoria had built between them had been constructed from nothing but deception. In that moment of devastating truth and hard-won peace, Delaney knew what she had to do, for she could no longer let a lie stand between herself and Lucian, and she resolved to face the woman who had wielded her father's memory as a weapon, no longer as a wounded girl to be manipulated, but as the daughter of a hero who had nothing left to fear. The confrontation came at last within the grand and shadowed halls of the Marchetti estate, where Delaney walked in, not as the trembling girl who had fled in tears, but as the daughter of a hero, her head held high, and her father's letter clutched in her hand, and when she stood before Vittoria, she spoke with a quiet strength that pierced deeper than any accusation. "I know the truth now," she said. "I know that my father chose to die to protect this family, and to protect me, and I know that you knew it all along, yet you took the most noble act of his life, and twisted it into a lie to drive me away. Tell me, how could a mother wield a dead man's sacrifice as a weapon against her own son's happiness?" For the first time in her long life of unchallenged command, Vittoria Marchetti found she had no answer, no scheme, no cutting reply, for the sight of the letter in Delaney's hand, and the calm dignity in the young woman's eyes, stripped away every defense she had built, and as the weight of what she had done pressed down upon her, the matriarch's rigid composure finally crumbled, and she sank into a chair with trembling hands, her voice breaking as 5 years of buried guilt rose to the surface. "I told myself I was protecting the family," she whispered. "I told myself that any means were justified. But the truth is, I could not bear to lose control of my son. I could not accept that his heart belonged to someone I had not chosen. And in my fear I became something monstrous. I have spent my life believing that power and control were the same as love, and now I see what my need to command has cost." And she wept then, truly wept, for the husband she had lost, and the son she had nearly destroyed, and the years of happiness she had stolen from two people who had only ever wanted each other. Delaney, who had every reason to answer cruelty with cruelty, chose instead the harder and finer path, for she had learned through her own suffering that hatred only deepened wounds, while forgiveness alone could heal them, and she knelt beside the broken woman and spoke gently. "I will not pretend that what you did not hurt me, but I have lost too many years to bitterness already, and I have no wish to lose any more. My father gave his life so that others might find peace, and I would dishonor him if I could not find it in myself to let this anger go. So let us end the cycle here." And Vittoria looked up at the woman she had wronged so deeply, overcome by a compassion she had never earned, and in that moment, the matriarch who had ruled through fear finally began to lay down the burden of control she had carried for so long. As for Enzo, whose lies had cost Delaney so dearly even as they had been spoken out of a misguided devotion, Lucian did not answer betrayal with the ruthlessness their world so often demanded, for he understood that the man had acted out of loyalty twisted by his own certainty of what was best, and so he spared his life but stripped him of his place at his side, telling him quietly that a man who would take it upon himself to decide the fate of another's heart could no longer be trusted to stand so close. And Enzo, humbled and full of remorse, accepted his fall from grace as a mercy he did not deserve, and departed to rebuild whatever life remained to him. And so the storm that had raged for 5 long years finally passed, and in its wake Delaney and Lucian found the peace that had been stolen from them, no longer divided by lies or secrets or the schemes of those who sought to command their hearts, but free at last, to love one another openly and without fear. And in the golden months that followed, Delaney did the one thing that mattered most to her. She restored her father's little bar to all its former warmth and reopened its doors, but she gave it a new name, hanging above the entrance, the name of her beloved mother, so that both the parents who had shaped her with their love would live on in the place where her happiest memories had been born. On the evening of its reopening, the little bar glowed with warm light and gentle music from the old jukebox her mother had loved. And Delaney stood in the doorway with Lucian's arm around her, watching the laughter and life fill the room her father had once tended. And she understood that after all the pain and betrayal and heartbreak she had finally come home, not merely to a place, but to a love that had endured every darkness and emerged unbroken. And as she leaned into the man who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe, she knew that the journey through sorrow had led her at last to a happiness, all the more precious for how dearly it had been won. Thank you so much for joining us all the way to the end of this story. And if this tale of love, sacrifice, and the triumph of the heart moved you in any way, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel, to press the like button, and to share this video so that you never miss the many touching stories we bring you every day. We would love to know how this story made you feel, so please take a moment to leave a comment and share the emotions that stirred within your heart as you listened, for it means the world to us to hear your honest thoughts and reflections. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, happy days ahead. Until we meet again in the next story, goodbye, and take good care of yourselves.